Right. When I was in college, I went and did a study abroad program in Zimbabwe and stayed there for 5 months and traveled around the country. And it was really focused on Southern African studies, so kind of studying the politics and culture and history of the entire region. And then after I was done with the program, I took a month and traveled throughout other parts of Africa. Well, the language in Zimbabwe, there are really three languages. The official language is English. Zimbabwe was a British colony, and so during colonial times, English kind of became the official language. And once it gained independence, then there were two national languages. Shona, which is actually the language that I studied and I learned, and about 80% of the population speaks Shona. And then the other language, which is more in the southwest, is the language called Sindebele. And so that's a smaller group of folks speak Sindebele. And I learned a little bit of that, and that is a language that's related to Zulu. Um, People kind of migrated out of southern Africa and came up into Zimbabwe, and the language evolved a little bit. So I learned some of those languages there. Yeah, you do have to get shots before you go. Um, I can't, it was about 10 years ago, so I can't necessarily remember all of the shots. The one I remember most is the one for yellow fever, because that's a little bit more of a tricky shot. They put it in between the layers of skin, um, so it's that one's a little bit more painful as opposed to going into the muscle. I actually, when I was a child, my family was supposed to go to Nigeria, and the only thing I really remember about that, I was 5 at the time, is that we went to get our shots, and the yellow fever one hurt so bad that we all went out for ice cream afterwards. So I kind of associate ice cream and getting vaccinations. In terms of accommodations, when we were there, at first we stayed in a small college in Harare, which is the capital city. And we stayed there for a couple of weeks, kind of getting oriented and starting to do some language training. And then we were placed in homestays for about 10 weeks, where we stayed with a family. And there were 10 of us on the program, so we were all kind of farmed out to different families. So that was really a wonderful experience to get to stay with the Zimbabwean families. But really, at the time I was there, um, in South Africa, apartheid was still in place. The whites were still in power. So a lot of the politics were looking at kind of going from colonialism to independence, and how the apartheid in South Africa, how that was kind of exported to other countries through support of kind of guerrilla movements, and so really kind of studying the dynamics of that. Well, when I was here in the United States, I was involved more in protests and those kind of movements, and that's really what spurred my interest to wanting to go to Southern Africa. So I actually was involved with a group called the Mozambique Support Network. And Mozambique is a neighboring country to Zimbabwe on the east. and really was ravaged by a war that was sponsored by South Africa. And so when I was in the States, I did work to raise money to support rebuilding schools and things like that. And so when I went to Zimbabwe, I spent some time studying kind of the relationship between Mozambique and Zimbabwe and how Zimbabwe was supporting Mozambique and what was going on there. Well, Africa is an extremely large continent, and so it's very varied in terms of the animal life and the topography and geography and all that. So most, I think, Americans' picture of Africa is that just it's the safari, and there are kind of elephants and tigers running all over the place, or elephants and lions and all that kind of stuff. And in reality, like Harare is a city of 500,000 people, or at least it was at the time when I was there. So it's a large metropolitan area. It has skyscrapers and suburbs and all that kind of stuff. So I think most people's picture of what Africa is and the reality of Africa is very different. So in the city, there's no wild animals running around. Although, I mean, there are some things that are different. Like you might, instead of having squirrels, there'll be monkeys in the trees. You know, so whereas for someone from Africa to come here and see squirrels, they think that's a wild animal because it's not what they're used to. In the same way, when we go over there and see monkeys, it's not what we're used to. So, but more of the big game animals are more in preserves, and so it's not like they're just elephants running around town. That's a very interesting question, because of course, kind of the stuff that I read was that, you know, if you go into it with a family, you have to be very careful about what you wear and what your dress is, and that kind of women's roles is much more subservient. And I stayed with a family where there was the mother who spoke no English or very little English, and then 6 children who were all adults, and then and then some of their children were there too. So, and it was very, very open. When I came at first, I expected that all the women would wear dresses, and that's what we were told, is that all the women in our group had to wear dresses and skirts. And right away I get there, and all my sisters were wearing t-shirts and blue jeans, and one had a Madonna shirt on. And so, and then one of my brothers had studied for 6 years in the Soviet Union, studied economics, and was very into reggae music. And so the family itself, even though they weren't really an upper class family, but they had had lots of experiences that made them a little bit more cosmopolitan. But in general, I think with kind of gender roles, that it's a little bit more traditional in terms of men doing certain things and women doing other things. But there's lots of flexibility in there too. The kind of the staple food in Zimbabwe is really a thick cornmeal porridge. So it becomes almost the consistency of bread, but it's all cornmeal. So it's a little bit like, for your experience, a little bit like grits. But you keep, after you get it to the grit stage, you keep adding a little bit more cornmeal, so it gets really thick, and you eat it with your hands. And then with that, eat greens very similar to collard greens, and usually a soup made with some kind of meat. I'd really love to go back, but it's really expensive. So, I mean, I think now to fly to Zimbabwe is probably over $3,000. Or so, in that kind of ballpark range. So it's really, especially now that I have a family and all that, it's much harder to think about, though I really would like to go back. But it's fun for me to think back on my time there too. So I appreciate your questions.